Hello, my name is Connor. Today I would like to share my thoughts on grooming gangs, a very heated and controversial subject at the moment. Though to be honest, it's been in the public consciousness for over a decade now, since 2011, 2012 sort of time. And I must admit, like a lot of other people, it made me very angry to hear that this sort of thing was going on, and that a lot of the time it was covered up because the people who were, I suppose, in positions of responsibility in the places where this was happening didn't want to deal with it because fears of various things, being seen as racist, causing racial tension. And the reason for this is because for many of these grooming gangs, they were made up either exclusively or mostly of Muslims. And of course, the vast majority of Muslims in Britain are not white, so that's where the racial aspect can come in. But I'll explain why I suppose the Muslim aspect is more important than the racial or ethnic aspect. But of course, many, especially on the left wing of the political spectrum, have been quick to point out that there are many other grooming gangs, possibly most grooming gangs, whose members are not Muslim, and they have a what I'm going to define as a native origin, which is basically people whose roots lie in this country from a time before 1945. Obviously, after 1945, that's when we've had the most significant mass immigration to Britain for a very long time. I'm going to fully admit that at the time I found out about this over a decade ago, it did contribute to me becoming racist and neo-Nazi and so on. And I personally think that that's because of how this issue was approached by both sides of the political spectrum, which is why today I would like to approach it from a more objective and analytical approach. Now, of course, this is my own opinion on it, my own analysis, my own perspective, but it's still trying to understand it as a phenomenon sociologically, rather than necessarily like just using it as a prop for some political narrative, because the politics honestly is getting in the way of people actually understanding it so they can deal with it. So that's what I would like to try and do today, is to actually lay out what it actually is, what the phenomenon seems to represent, what I think has caused it. So first of all, probably would be good to define what a grooming gang is. There are issues with this because it generally falls into the category of child sexual exploitation, which is, of course, criminal activity that is very heavily opposed by most people. But there's an issue with the definition of a child in this particular context, I believe, because what I have noticed is, first of all, they pretty much seem to be invariably female. Child sexual exploitation can include boys and girls, but this particular phenomenon seems to only focus on girls. And from what I can tell, in the vast majority of instances, these girls have reached puberty. Now, legally speaking, if they're under 16, they're children, because 16 is the age of consent in this country. But most people reach puberty before the age of 16. So they are physically and biologically sexually mature, potentially before the age of consent. So they're still, in a legal sense, counted as children. I think the term minor is probably a more accurate term for somebody who's below the age of consent than a child, because a child, to me, really does seem to imply somebody who's not reached puberty yet. Now, of course, we have a term for people who are sexually interested in children, which is paedophile. The issue with this is that, like I've said, most of the victims of grooming gangs don't seem to be children in a biological sense. And that would mean, even though the the grooming gang's members are considered paedophiles in a legal sense. There's another name for people who have sexually interested in people who have kind of just reached puberty. I think it's ephebophile. This confuses things because, yeah, a lot of people are saying that this is child sexual exploitation, which in a legal sense it most definitely is, but in a biological sense I think it's something a little bit different because of the fact that as far as I can tell, all of the victims are female and they've pretty much all reached sexual maturity, even if only just. So that's an important distinction to make. And I can give you two examples where the members of the gangs are all, native British as opposed to Muslim or otherwise. So the first example comes from Bolton in the Greater Manchester area. I believe that this is a grooming gang made up of completely native, non-Muslim members. Now, the BBC wrote an article about a grooming gang from Glasgow, but I take issue with calling this group a grooming gang. It seems more like a child molestation ring, or paedophile ring, or however you want to call it. Because the difference is, in the Bolton case, all the victims seem to have reached puberty, whereas in the Glasgow case, the victims seem to have been really young. Like, I'm talking still wearing nappies, young. These are two different phenomena, in my opinion, because to be sexually interested in, like, toddlers, or at least sexually engaged with them, is that's different from being sexually engaged with, like, girls that have just reached puberty. I don't think it can really be considered the same. Obviously, from a legal definition, both are considered illegal and forms of abuse, which I completely agree with. Oh, the other thing also I want to mention is in the Glasgow case, the victims, there was 2 girls and a boy. So it really seems like in the Glasgow case, the emphasis is on child abuse, as opposed to early pubescent girl abuse. And that really seems to be, in my view, what the grooming gang thing is all about. It is focusing on targeting early pubescent girls. I think that on this basis, I'm going to put forward my theory on the causes of the grooming gangs thing. So if we take it for this definition specifically, that it is men who prey on early pubescent girls. They are physically, biologically capable of having sex, but of course, it's neither legally nor morally right to do so. But I should go without saying, but I feel like I have to emphasize that. This is going with this definition. Why would this be the case? Why would this be happening? In my opinion, there's 2 main reasons. This is to account for pretty much all the cases of grooming gangs. The first one's misogyny, and the second is poverty. Why do I say this? As for the first reason, all the victims are female. So, not all of the perpetrators or people involved in the grooming gangs are necessarily men. Obviously, the vast majority are. But you can be a female misogynist, or you can... there's probably multiple aspects to it. You could include ageism and classism in it as well, because, of course, that ties into the second reason, poverty, which is that, actually, in a lot of these cases, the perpetrators and victims belonged to the lower end of the socio-economic scale. Now, this is why I would also distinguish the grooming gangs thing from... sometimes you hear about these cases where children have been abused by, let's say, priests or any other type of clergy, policemen. This does overlap with the grooming gangs thing, unfortunately. And also, like politicians or, people who have some sort of institutional power. The grooming gangs thing tends to be different from that, although, like I said, with some exceptions. For the most part, the perpetrators, they don't have institutional power of any kind, again with some exceptions. Their power just seems to come from the fact that they're like older and men, I guess, which is, that's like more of an interpersonal power dynamic. The institutional aspect basically isn't there to the same extent as it is, in these other cases. So I would for the most part, consider that also the institutional power aspect of sexually exploiting minors to be somewhat separate. So focus on the grooming gangs. It's mainly a phenomenon where, so let's say, it's happening in the poorer areas of society, the most deprived areas. And of course, this ties into why Muslims would be overrepresented in grooming gangs, because Muslims tend to be on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And of course, the victims also tended to come from, this strata of society as well. So you can definitely see a pattern there. This is something that is mostly affecting the poorest in our society, this particular phenomenon. Now, why would this be the case? Why has this started happening? As far as I can tell, I don't know about any cases of this particular kind happening before the 1990s, because that's when this sort of thing is supposed to have started happening in Rotherham, with specifically Muslim men, targeting girls from a native background. And yeah, I don't know if this was happening before, but I'm going to, at this point, introduce a sociological concept called anomie. This concept was introduced by the French Jewish sociologist Émile Durkheim, and he was using it as a way to explain, this was to provide sociological rather than maybe psychological causes for why people would commit suicide. And basically the theory is that anomie is considered to be a state that individuals can enter into whenever they come to feel alienated from the rest of society, like they're not connecting with the broader society, general sense of purposelessness as well. And he thought that this would come about, it would get worse if there was significant economic change in a society, which the time he was talking about was mostly referring to the Industrial Revolution. Now, I would tie this into the grooming gangs thing by emphasizing the economic liberalization brought in the 80s by Margaret Thatcher, because this had a massive effect on the British working class through, in particular, deindustrialization. Because you got to remember, the Industrial Revolution, whole communities in some cases were built around industries, whether it was coal mining, fishing, shipbuilding, milling, anything like that. You could have whole new towns built. Like New Lanark here in Scotland. There's a place called Nelson in England, which just was created out of nowhere for around the particular industry that was there, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But the point is that you basically had whole communities, and for generations they were geared towards these industries. And if you came from any of these communities, it was quite likely you'd end up working in these industries. But in the 80s, practically all of that disappeared. You have these generations of young folk gearing up to have jobs in their local heavy industry or whatever, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh well, we're offshoring this particular industry because it's cheaper. What are they going to do now? They just have to find some other work. Unemployment rose quite a lot in the 80s. And so you get into the 90s, and suddenly we have this grooming gangs thing popping up among the working class and underclass and so on. The non-native aspect is important in this. So first of all, because Muslims in particular, they tend to be on the lower side of the socioeconomic spectrum, so they tend to be overrepresented. But of course, being of a foreign culture, that's only going to make the experience of anomie worse. It's going to be an aggravating factor. I'm going to say something else as well. Focusing on the misogyny aspect, which I think is the main factor in this, apart from obviously the poverty. It's still prevalent in the West, but not to the same degree that it was in the past. I do think that feminism has, contributed to the reduction of misogyny, broadly speaking. Although a lot of the time you do tend to find like more traditional ways of viewing the world among the working class that don't tend to be as progressive as like bourgeoisie or whatever, middle class. I would say that's an explanation as to why, like, in the sort of modern progressive West, where, even though a lot of men have been taught to respect women, there are still men who don't respect women. And in these particular cases, seek to exploit vulnerable women. But compared to Western culture, some of these other cultures, like Islamic culture, they are more likely to be misogynistic, quite honestly. I think this accounts for the overrepresentation of these groups in members of grooming gangs, on top of the fact that they tend to be on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, and they're culturally foreign as well, on top of that. It's like that all contributes to the overrepresentation of people from these backgrounds involved in these groups. Hopefully, this can help explain why certain groups are overrepresented in this phenomenon. A lot of it does have to do with group dynamics. So, considering the self and the other in a group dynamic perspective. So, if poverty is a source of stress for people, and the economic change, whether it's positive or negative, as Durkheim claimed, is a source of anomie for people. Okay, so let's consider poorer people, let's say poorer men, experiencing increased levels of anomie. So first of all, in the context of a grooming gang, the identification with the self is male, and the other is female. When you consider non-native grooming gangs, you add on top of that the self identification and the other. You might have noticed that a lot of people tend to reference Pakistanis in the context of grooming gangs, and so far I've only talked about Muslims. And there's a reason for this, which is that British Muslims tend to identify primarily with their religion rather than their ethnicity. So the fact that a lot of the high-profile instances of grooming gangs, the men are ethnically Pakistani, just kind of reflects that they're the largest group of Muslims in this country, although they're not the majority by any means. They're about, I think they're over a third of British Muslims. British Muslims are quite diverse. And there's a case from Newcastle in which the members were from a diverse array of ethnic backgrounds, but they were all Muslim. So the fact that British Muslims tend to identify firstly as Muslim and then, well, they tend to identify as British after Muslim, and then their ethnicity will come after that. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course. I have come across one example. I'm not sure, I can't quite remember the details, but I think the gang and the victim were all Muslim, but there was an ethnic difference between the gang members and the victim. So I hope that I have clarified this very sensitive subject. I would like to say that I think that we should be able to talk about this problem, because I think just either, making it out to be a problem that is solely a result of immigration, which is a perspective that I have seen some on the right make, or that it is simply a racist or Islamophobic talking point, as I have seen some on the left claim, which I agree that in some cases it is, but it's really not helping in making it difficult to actually, talk about the problem and acknowledge what's going on. And I think we should be able to talk about this more openly. And one last thing I will say as well, I did try and find out this information, and I didn't manage to, but if anybody out there is interested in uncovering the sort of proportion of grooming gang members based on their ethnicity, because the report that came out this year pointed out that 2/3 of, grooming gang members' ethnicity is not known. If you can find out which cases those are, and you look at the names of the members, you should be able to infer pretty easily what their background is. Muslims tend to have Arabic names, and natives tend to have, well, you presumably know what kind of names, like, native British people have. I tried this and I couldn't find it. I couldn't really get that kind of access to that information on the internet. It was quite difficult. But I would hope that somebody else would be able to find this out, so that we can get a more accurate understanding of the proportion of like how many of these gangs there actually are relative to each other. Because even though the statistical possibility is that most grooming gang members are native, yeah, there's a possibility that quite a significant amount are actually Muslim. So, but again, I would emphasize that we can explain why this would be the case. There are some things in the Islamic religion as well that would potentially be aggravating factors. I think especially in the misogynistic aspect. And I don't think it's Islamophobic to say that. I mean, as a religion, it is strongly patriarchal. And I think that this would feed into misogyny more than, the native Western culture, which, yes, it does have its roots in patriarchy, but we've been moving away from that gradually. Like I said, the examples of native grooming gangs show that obviously it's still around. I think it's just a wee bit deflective to try and claim that it's the same across the board. That, the average native British man is just as likely to be misogynistic as the average British Muslim. And it's just, I don't think that's realistic, to be honest. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, dear viewer. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel so that it can grow and encourage me to make more videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will speak to you again soon.